September 11th was one of the darkest days in American history that ironically began as a clear, sunny day. And to add to the irony, it was a sunny relief to the stormy weather of September 10th. It was the beginning of New York Fashion Week. JLo and Ja Rule's I'm Real sat at the top of the Billboard Hot 100. Competition reality TV mainstay The Amazing Race had just premiered for the first time the week before, and NBC's must-see TV lineup, led by a plethora of shows based in New York City, was the television delight of millions, and the soundtrack for Mariah Carey's critically panned romantic musical drama Glitter had just been released. Up until 8:45 a.m., it was just another day, and nearly 60 seconds later, the world would never be or feel the same again. The immediate aftermath of September 11th found millions of Americans glued to their television screens, ingesting hours worth of gruesome footage of what once was the Twin Towers that had been a part of New York City's skyline for more than 30 years at that point. Millions remained in a state of arrested development, unsure of what to say or do or feel, oscillating between anger, angst, sadness, and confusion. None of the usual comforts of pop culture felt all that comforting or even appropriate at this point in the face of mass devastation. In fact, there was a heavy sense of apathy, with everything feeling frivolous and nothing really mattering, with a lot of news publications saying that the innocence was over. But to the US government, that couldn't become a reality because very soon after, we were told to get out of our houses, spend money, go and see a Broadway show, try and live life like it was September 10th. There was a call for everyone to go back to normal. But just remember, we're all Americans and we're all united except for the ones that we deem as not being American enough. And if we sit by and do nothing, then the terrorists win. And 20 years later, the United States is still using that same playbook of smiling and spending through trauma, as when faced with a global pandemic, it told its citizens to go back to normal. It's a very there is no war in Ba Sing Se approach. From September 11th onward, the American pop culture sphere was completely changed, and we're still experiencing those changes to this day, almost 25 years later. Hi, I'm Bobby, this is Culture Kitsch, and today we'll be taking a deep dive into the impact of 9/11 on pop culture. Disclaimer, this is a massive topic and I won't be able to cover every single facet of it in this one video, but I will be linking a lot of sources that I use for research for this, as well as a lot of really great channels that have gone in depth into specific topics that we'll be talking about today. So if you'd like to learn more, all of that information will be down below. Also, I am not here to tell you how to feel about the event of 9/11 and the ensuing aftermath of it. If you were alive to remember it and to have very strong feelings about it, this is simply a cultural overview. If you have any personal anecdotes that you'd like to share, I'd love to read them down in the comments. Pop culture was already looking very different by 12 p.m. on September 11th. Major channels had halted programming to switch to the major news networks like ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox. And you know it was serious because they also halted commercials. It's only something very, very serious that happens in America that causes capitalism to not stop, but pause. Sporting events were also canceled, though WWE, formerly WWF's then Thursday Night SmackDown, would air live on September 13th from Houston, Texas, making it the first major public event to be held of its size. The fact that they really relish in still, and in hindsight might not have been the safest thing to do 2 days after a major terrorist attack, but USA. Disney World was closed for the first time in its history, and this wouldn't happen again until the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic in March of 2020. And most prominently, by the afternoon, Clear Channel, now iHeartMedia, had sent out a memorandum of 150 plus songs that were to be pulled from radio stations across the nation that had content that was either too close to the events of the day or were deemed too celebratory. These songs range from maybe Understandably, It's the End of the World as We Know It, and I Feel Fine by REM, and Jump by Van Halen. But they also pulled any largely political songs or groups, like the memorandum banned the entire discography of Rage Against the Machine. Which leads us into our first section, music. Music was interesting in a post 9/11 world, and it began with that memorandum I mentioned. Almost immediately, we were curtailing our artistic taste to take into account this very new and fresh tragedy. The musical identity of our new state of mourning was marked by being sorrowful but hopeful, but not too hopeful as to forget the sorrow. Remember that we are coming off of the 1990s, which was a decade of letting the good times roll in a lot of ways, with bubblegum pop, hip hop, and nu metal dominating the airways by the end of the decade. The headset mic-ridden, catchy works of the Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, and most prominently Britney Spears were the rhythm of a youthful nation that had its downfalls but was doing alright for the most part. The sounds of artists like Missy Elliott, Outkast, and Jay-Z, whose album The Blueprint was released on September 11th, were taking hip-hop into the new millennium, and nu metal, well, they just wanted to break shit. But now what dominated stations across the country were songs of resilience and sadness that might have been the only thing that made sense at that time. In the weeks following, there were countless musical tribute specials like America, a tribute to heroes, the concert for New York City, and United We Stand that brought together musicians from all genres to memorialize victims and raise funds for relief efforts. And even Congress thought it necessary to sue the nation with a pitchy at best rendition of God Bless America. As if we weren't already going through enough. Soon after, we began to see original works about the events themselves, and there are a lot of them, like Coldplay's Politic and Bruce Springsteen's 2002 album, The Rising, which features many songs about the day from various perspectives. However, not every song about 9/11 was reverent and sorrowful. One genre embraced a rather aggressive and retributive sound. Country. The growth of American Jingoism due to 9/11 was certainly not a shock, but country music's embrace of it was something. For a solid 5-year run, the subgenre of country music that can be best described as this was churning out chart-topping hits that were all about America and freedom and the flag, and most pronounced, the military. It's worth it to note that less than a month after the attacks, the United States would announce an invasion of Afghanistan in October of 2001, seemingly jump-starting their revenge tour for the events of 9/11. The hallmark of this sound is Toby Keith's Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue that features the lyric, "'Cause we'll put a boot in your ass is the American way." This genre that sounds like if an American flag gained sentience and started making music had had a place in the charts for years, according to executive director of country radio broadcasters R.J. Curtis when he talked to Rolling Stone, saying, "If you put USA or America in a song, you had a pretty good chance of getting attention." To be fair, there were also songs like Alan Jackson's Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning that were what Joshua Huddock for Rolling Stones described as, quote, explicitly a song for those who, like Jackson and his listeners, lived far away from New York or DC and were struggling to make sense of what happened there. These songs and the ensuing sentiments and culture around them became a defining factor for country music for almost 20 years and hasn't until now began to let up. But as the War on Terror began, some country music artists began to diverge from this messaging. Most famously, the Chicks, whose lead singer Natalie Maines criticized then President George W. Bush for the U.S.'s involvement in the Iraq War, an action that would get the group blackballed and spur the song Not Ready to Make Nice, which would then in turn inspire a new crop of country artists, including Casey Musgraves. Back in the sphere of popular music, there was a sentiment in the early days that bubblegum pop and its princess Britney Spears were going to be passé and out of date. In fact, there were many cases of vandalism of her upcoming HBO special because she was in turn a representation of all that was frivolous in American pop culture. But not too long after this, the crowds of TRL began to fill back up again, and American pop music was back on top. Its brief moment of reverence had already alleviated by the end of the year. On the fringes of popular music, anti-war songs began to crop up, like Rage Against the Machine's 2003 song March of Death, and most popularly, Green Day's American Idiot. Green Day's American Idiot is perhaps the best example of what a lot of young people felt at this point, having just seen the events of 9/11, and in turn also seen many of them be sent off to fight an unjust war. Green Day's American Idiot felt very representative of their disillusionment and in turn angst to what was happening with their government. American Idiot was certainly a hit, but many critics have theorized a sort of wave of political defanging that happened with post 9/11 American pop culture. There was mounting disapproval of the war and growing disgruntlement with how long it was going on. It's here towards the end of the 2000s that we get songs like John Mayer's Waiting on the World to Change or the Black Eyed Peas' Where is the Love that began to lament about the state of the world and how the US still has many domestic problems to address instead of fighting its forever war overseas that got millions of innocent people killed. The music of post 9/11 America does retain some of that political defanging that I mentioned earlier. This could be due in large part to the fact that many Americans have grown very disillusioned with their government and the interest that it has in the health and well-being of the average American citizen. We didn't see a great renaissance of protest songs coming out around this time, but we did see a slight resurgence of it in the early 2020s, mainly with Kendrick Lamar's All Right, that was used very prominently during the Black Lives Matter protests. But as a whole, music in post 9/11 America definitely felt different. Almost immediately after the events of 9/11, the silver screen began going through a very drastic change. Starting on September 11th and for the next couple of weeks, many films that were pending release had to hastily re-edit many of their scenes that would potentially either evoke images similar to the events of 9/11, aka large explosions, or completely erase images of the Twin Towers. Films like the first of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy and Disney's Lilo and Stitch would famously have to re-edit much of their imagery to take into account the tragedy. For Spider-Man, many of the promotional material and the trailer for the film would feature a spot with the Twin Towers, and one of the ending sequences of Lilo and Stitch would have Stitch flying through downtown Honolulu in a hijacked jetliner, weaving and bobbing through buildings, which obviously was not going to be received well for its 2002 release. Spider-Man is an interesting case as New York City is basically a character in the canon of the superhero, so the disappearance of the Twin Towers from its skyline had to be taken into account. Scenes that were meant to show the resiliency of New Yorkers and a love of the USA were added to the film, like the fight on the Queensboro Bridge where the citizens fought back against the Green Goblin, uttering that if you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. And one of the final shots of the film, which features the Man of Spider holding on to a flagpole with an American flag flying high. In the case of Lilo and Stitch, this entire sequence had to be reworked very quickly before its release in 2002, which if you know anything about animation, that is a crazy feat to accomplish. The initial cut of the scene was put on a special edition DVD some years later, and you could see that the things that had to be reworked were making the plane that Stitch flew look a little bit more alien and like a spaceship, making its interior cabin look a little bit more Star Trek-esque rather than the cabin of a commercial jetliner, and of course, changing the surrounding location from being a downtown city center to a remote beach that was devoid of any humans. Most films had to release in the month of September that had remotely anything to do with action and could potentially evoke the images of September 11th were also pushed, including Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York and Training Day, starring Denzel Washington. Independence Day, Deep Impact, and Armageddon all featured scenes that featured New York, specifically the World Trade Center, in peril, with Armageddon featuring a scene that looked eerily similar to a lot of news footage of the towers after they had been hit. They also had to be pulled from any television syndication and quickly re-edited. In fact, a lot of films that had been released but just happened to take place in New York had to be digitally re-edited to erase any image of the Twin Towers. In a sense, Hollywood was trying to completely erase the image of the Twin Towers from its cinematic history as not to evoke sorrow. So far, you've noticed that the immediate cultural response of 9/11 was a lot of censorship. It was the equivalent of sending a child out of a room during the violent part of a movie. In an attempt to protect its very fragile public, censorship loomed heavily over Hollywood and other related industries. On the one hand, it was completely understandable, as many people were regularly taking in this very devastating imagery, and lots of Hollywood films could potentially become triggers for them. It's almost important to know that almost every second of the terrorist attacks of September 11th, both in New York City and Washington, D.C., were being documented in real time. It's a bit different to an event like the sinking of the Titanic that was largely recounted and documented in the stories of people who were on the ship and survived. 9/11 could be recounted in multiple ways, including survivor stories, news coverage, the work of photojournalists, and there was a massive growth of amateur filmmaking that was happening around this time, as there were many consumer-grade camcorders that were on the market and were owned by lots of people. So your average Joe Schmo could go out on the street if he lived in New York City and also record his own recollection of the day's events. Everyone basically had a connection to the event in some way. On the other hand, they were very understandably critics of the censorship of post 9/11 media, with many calling into account the question of autonomy in art. On a grander scale, it could also call into question of what narratives and images are being disseminated to the public around the events of this tragedy, which led many scholars to theorize that this form of censorship could influence the emotions of the country and almost provide a blank check for imperialistic aggression in the name of protecting the country and saving democracy. The headline from The Onion, funnily enough, does the best job of summing up what the potential fear was when it comes to this type of censorship. US vows to defeat whoever it is we're at war with. It would be another 4 or 5 years before Hollywood decided what it wanted to do with the events of the day. In the immediate, there were thoughts that there would be no more films that would show wide-scale destruction and that Hollywood media would become a lot more kinder and gentler, almost as if to serve as a security blanket for a very wounded nation. That would not last. Films like Steven Spielberg's War of the World dealt with the events of 9/11 in a more indirect way, with academics Maria Flood and Michael C. Frank for the conversation saying, Steven Spielberg's 2005 adaptation of The War of the World transplants H.G. Wells' late Victorian story to post 9/11 New Jersey and Boston. The tagline of the film, quote, "They're already here," echoes fears of sleeper cells, suggesting that the enemy is already in the U.S., undetectable and waiting to be activated. After the alien tripods have emerged from below the ground to wreak havoc on innocent bystanders, the protagonist's daughter asks her ash-covered father, is it the terrorists? And in the 5th anniversary of the attacks, Hollywood was ready to take on the events of the day head on, with Oliver Stone's World Trade Center and Paul Greengrass's United 93, both released in 2006. The first of which depicted the events in New York City from the perspective of 2 police officers who found themselves trapped in the North Tower during the collapse of the South Tower, and the second which told the harrowing tale of the passengers who took back the hijacked plane United 93, potentially thwarting another terrorist attack. Both films involve the families of victims and the survivors in their production, with United 93 having real people play themselves in the film, and World Trade Center having the officers John McLaughlin and Will Jimeno and their wives involved in the writing and production. Though it is important to note that both films did face some backlash from the family members of victims with how their specific family members were depicted, or just simply with being involved in the production that does commercialize their loved one's death. These films were decently well received and did pretty okay at the box office, but they weren't carried through cinematic history in the same way as something like 1997's Titanic, which has essentially eclipsed the historical event that it's depicting. One could argue that the reason for this was that 5 years was still a little bit too soon, and the audiences that would be going to see this movie also lived through the event as it just took place 5 years prior, and so they may also not have been exactly ready to reckon and see depicted with a Hollywood lens this incredibly traumatic day. Hollywood didn't attempt many more movies that dealt with 9/11 directly from the perspective of sorrowful remembrance, and instead opted for escapist media centered around superheroes and fantastical worlds that could explore themes around 9/11 without directly recalling the events. Scholars cite Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight trilogy as being the impetus of the superhero genre beginning to explore this kind of grim, dark aesthetic. But of course, it is the Marvel Cinematic Universe that became a very large figure in post 9/11 film. And it certainly makes sense why they were so popular, as their narratives are about superhero figures coming in to save everyday people in terroristic situations, almost as if to rewrite the events of 9/11 in a much more fantastical way. And it's also worth it to note that there is government interest, let's just say, in these particular films when it comes to depictions of American government that tend to be centered around American exceptionalism that could also breed some pretty harmful rhetoric that the government used to its advantage around this time. These films came in tandem with films that are about the fallout of 9/11 and the ensuing military activity in Afghanistan and Iraq, like American Sniper, Zero Dark 30, and other films like Cloverfield, Remember Me, that is not a 9/11 film into the very, very end, and extremely loud and incredibly close. We also have to note that there is a looming presence of stereotypes that plagued a lot of post 9/11 media, specifically with how people from the Middle East were being depicted. We all know the famous sepia tone that went rampant in a lot of 2000s and 2010s film when depicting any country that it was inhabited by mostly brown people, and there was a sense of just a general flattening of a lot of Middle Eastern cultures. And you can definitely see how this flattening of culture would do harm in the real world. Many black and brown people, especially Muslim Americans in the country, were being faced with a lot of heavy stereotypical material that came out around this time that was heavily influencing how they were living life in this country. The topic of film in post 9/11 America is far too vast to cover in one video and would probably have to be its own video, but in the meantime, I highly recommend Lindsay Ellis's Loose Cannon series that covers films directly dealing with the events of 9/11, both from a domestic perspective and an international perspective. Television perhaps has the most interesting relationship with 9/11, as it was how many of us received news of the events. The 24-hour news cycle was all but cemented in our everyday lives, as millions were watching every single day, hours worth of footage of the towers being hit, them collapsing, and in the very early days of news coverage, some very horrific images that featured people falling from the towers to their deaths. The ramifications of seeing images like that for days and hours and weeks on end, we are still figuring out to this day. Television was essentially the door into this new world that we were getting to know and would be for the next 20 years. On the news front, the presence of the news ticker became a mainstay for many news channels, allowing for multiple pieces of news to be reported on at the same time. Federal investigations, survivor recounts, and relief efforts were pretty much all that dominated TV for the coming weeks, especially with the announcement of the US invasion of Afghanistan less than a month later. For non-news TV, the first steps forward came from the world of late night television, as one by one the hosts of very popular late night shows came back on air, many of them taping live from New York City. The first of which to return to air was David Letterman, who delivered a powerful and honest monologue that was a more cathartic heart-to-heart to a nation that didn't know what to do either than an opener to a late-night talk show. Hosts like Jon Stewart, who then went on to be a strong advocate for healthcare for 9/11 first responders, delivered a powerful and tearful opener to political satire show The Daily Show that very briefly revealed that the people in our TVs were not just entertainers, but people just like us, people who were sad and angry and confused, just like us. The death toll of 9/11 has almost doubled due to the fact that more people have died due to toxic exposure from ground zero, including survivors and first responders, than people who were killed on the day. So we are very much so still dealing with the healthcare aftermath of an event like that 25 years later. Jokes weren't completely devoid at this time, but there was a looming sense of feeling like we had to ask if we could call on the security blanket that is comedy and humor. Live from New York, Saturday Night Live returned with a group of firefighters wearing their gear that was covered in ash from the rubble, and then New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who, if you can believe it, had been deemed Times Person of the Year and was seen as America's mayor. Crazy turn of events. The tone of the first Saturday Night Live post 9/11 was humorous but a bit somber, and also for some reason featured blackface, like that was supposed to help. I don't know. Because of what used to be a much quicker production cycle, television was one of the first mediums to be able to respond to the events narratively, like NBC's political drama The West Wing that aired an episode dealing with terrorism airing 3 weeks after the attacks. And many shows like 24 and Homeland were very guilty of perpetuating the insert brown person here and cast them in a negative light concept, and also made very regular practice of normalizing torture, which no doubt had very terrible in-person ramifications for black and brown people in the country, who, by the way, were probably also in mourning and also angry and sad. And what of shows that were set in New York City? In the 90s, many of the most popular sitcoms were set in New York City, like Friends, Living Single, and Seinfeld. New York City was the place for sitcoms, and by 2001, It felt like sitcoms were starting to move out of the city. Perhaps the wound of the city was too fresh, and in the minds of many Americans, New York felt very off limits. And so that's when we see the growth and prominence of shows like The Office and Parks and Rec and My Name is Earl that take place in other parts of the country. Of course, this isn't to say that TV avoided New York City, as there were still plenty of shows that were set in the city, like HBO's smash hit Sex and the City and 30 Rock. Many of these shows that were airing pre-2001 obviously featured imagery of the Twin Towers and the World Trade Center, and much of that imagery had to be scrubbed. In doing research for this video, I was very curious about what the response of children's media was. I don't feel like we often think about the impact of pop culture when it comes to kids, but kids media is incredibly important to the growth and development of kids. So how do you explain something of this scale to a child when the adults that are making them are also trying to make sense of it? One of the most prominently remembered for perhaps good and bad reasons is Disney Channel's Express Yourself series. These were originally a series of interstitials that featured Disney Channel stars talking about friendship and being yourself and general kid stuff. But the channel decided to do a special run of the Express Yourself series with its stars, discussing, albeit mostly indirectly, the events of 9/11. There's a really great article from Teen Vogue that I'll link down below that goes into much deeper detail about the general response and what the place of something like that was in media at the time. Many at the time saw it as a necessary and maybe cathartic message for kids who were dealing with the events that they saw probably in real time, and others saw it as much more propagandic in nature. Not too long after that, in 2004, Disney Channel featured the events of 9/11 in a DCOM called Tiger Cruise, starring a very young Hayden Panettiere. That is too much for this video, but it's just as crazy as it sounds. It was a noble attempt, I think, but still. The other side of the spectrum, children's media's most trusted teacher, PBS, also put out a lot of material around educating kids on the events of 9/11. Popular series Zoom did an episode talking about firefighters and how they help communities. Reading Rainbow did segments about 9/11 where host LeVar Burton talked to the kids of PS234 in New York City about how they cope with the events of the day and how children from around the world were sending messages of hope and love to the kids of the US. Fred Rogers came out of retirement to speak to kids and adults about how to deal with this difficult situation and encourage parents to have open discussions with their children. Arthur had a two-part episode dealing with the events of 9/11 indirectly, as the episode is set around a fire that takes place at the school, with each of the characters meant to depict a different emotion that the audience might have felt while watching the collapse of the Twin Towers. According to the Arthur Wiki, quote, "In the September 11th attacks, many experienced loss and trauma directly, which correlates with Sue Ellen losing her irreplaceable diary, and Binky is traumatized by the sight of the flames. And others felt tremendous anxiety after the disaster, with Arthur, who was anxious about his father's well-being. Meanwhile, many people were not directly affected by the attacks, yet still felt the impacts of the aftermath, which is represented by Buster, who was absent from school during the fire and feels disconnected." And finally, the show that has had New York City as its background for more than 50 years, Sesame Street, also did a segment talking about the events. In a segment featuring Elmo, an accidental fire breaks out in Mr. Hooper's store, which is promptly put out by real-life FDNY firefighters, who calm Elmo, ensuring him that firefighters are very important members of the community that keep everyone safe. Television eventually found its flow again, but you can tell that 9/11 made an indelible impact on the industry. And this finally brings us to internet culture and 9/11, and 9/11 almost as pop culture in and of itself. One of the most famous fallouts of 9/11 is chronicling the pop cultural journey of works that were inspired by or kind of directly related to the events. So there is a very popular chart that has appeared on Tumblr that chronicles that because of 9/11, Gerard Way started My Chemical Romance, which then inspired Stephenie Meyer to write Twilight, which eventually led to the creation of 50 Shades of Grey. And there are all of these different pop cultural things that wouldn't have happened, assumingly without 9/11, which in turn does lend itself to this uptick in what I'm calling the memification of 9/11 that has been happening much more prominently in the past 2 to 3 years. It's mainly centered around a lot of Gen Z people feeling very distant from the event and in turn finding some humor in it. But I think that's a video for next year. As we can see, tragic events shape culture in ways that many of us can't really anticipate. In the 20 plus years since the collapse of the Twin Towers, what we're listening to, what we're watching, and what we're wearing has been reflective of our collective uncertainty and anxiety for the future. The pop culture of this era was a snapshot of our collective anger and sadness and general confusion that ran the gamut from justified and vengeful to irrational and destructive to disillusioned and apathetic. The pop culture of a post 9/11 America is intense, complex, somewhat nuanced, at times aimless, and above all, an incredibly fascinating snapshot of modern history.